So we're going to have a little go round. I'll call on you, and all you have to do is say your name and kind of where you are, set the scene, whether you're outdoors, indoors, kitchen, living room, and what you see. Okay. So, Stuart Webb, let's
Yeah,
start with
hi,
you.
gang. I'm in Minneapolis. It's 70 degrees weather here. Just fantastic. We live in this retirement center, which is right on our back, right next to a park. So we're just living with all this nature, and it's just so lovely. And it's so wonderful to see all you guys. And I love that shirt that Sylvia's got on.
Welcome,
Okay.
Stuart. It's good to have you. Well, Nanette, you're next.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Nanette Shore, and I am sitting in my office in the Bronx, New York City. I work at a legal services office, and it's kind of a grayish day here, but it's warm and great to be here.
Great. Sylvia, you're next.
I'm Sylvia Clute. I'm in Richmond, Virginia, and this morning I just attended the grandparents meeting at my two grandchildren's school, their last event of the year, and it was beautiful. It was about service and love, and so I'm all elated about that.
Oh, wow. Sounds great. Janelle?
Hi, everyone. I'm Janelle. At the moment, I'm on vacation in Rome. And even though I'm on vacation, I really wanted to attend this webinar because I started to read what you had written, Jenny, and I was just fascinated. I could see the heart of the empire almost out my window, right by the Colosseum. But I'm actually here in Europe. I'm going to Hamburg, Germany tomorrow for a law conference organized by David Bollier and other activists around the Commons in Europe.
Great.
Very cool. Nice to have you with us all the way. You get the distance prize for sure. Duncan, you're next.
So, hello, everybody. I am sitting here on Cape Ann. I live in Gloucester, Massachusetts, looking over the Inner Harbor. It is a gorgeous day. And this morning at 8 o'clock, I was out rowing in a 6-man gig, which is just a kick. It was wonderful.
Cool. Sounds great. Ken, you're next.
Thanks. I'm in White Plains, New York, as I mentioned. I also live in Florida for 6 months in the winter. I'm retired from the field of civil litigation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good to have you.
Thank you, Perry.
Molly, look who's here. Hi, Molly.
Hi, Perry. I'm Molly Sobey, and I'm in Preston, Minnesota. It is absolutely gorgeous outside today, so I am looking outside at a beautiful maple tree and just enjoying life today.
Good to have you. Speak of the devil, it's Marjorie. Well, maybe that didn't sound quite right. Speak of the angel, it's Marjorie.
All right. I'll just move on. It's Marjorie Silver. I'm on the east end of Long Island and sitting at my desk where I look out over the tree that's getting greener and greener and the bird feeder that I love so much and the hummingbird feeder I put up that has not yet had any visitors.
Good to have you. Now the West Coast contingent, starting with Lisa.
Good morning, West Coast perspective. I'm Lisa. I'm sitting in Peters in my office, looking out the window at a beautiful day in San Francisco, remarkably beautiful. It sounds like it's beautiful everywhere today. I'm very excited to hear about this program. Thanks.
Great, great, great. Christina, you're next.
Hi, I'm Christina Loftus and I'm in Austin, Texas. So it's a nice day here as well. Not quite in the 70s, but if it's in the 80s, we'll take it. And yeah, I was outside earlier, but I am in my home office right now and glad to be here.
Well, we're glad you're here as well. Libby, you're next.
Hi, I'm in Denver and I'm looking out my window at City Park. And the lake is calm for the first time in 4 days. We've had lots of winds. It's a pretty day out there.
Oh my, nothing but good weather except here. Rand, welcome, Rand.
Yes, in Philadelphia, which is rainy and cold. I have many connections to many of the people and places on this group. My father had an apartment near the Colosseum in Rome, so I recognized where you were. I have a sister-in-law in Gloucester, Mass, so Duncan, I can recognize where you were. And I'm a retired professor of constitutional law. And many years ago, I read Jennifer Nedelsky's work on Madison with convention with much interest. And very interested in what you're doing now. So I'm very glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Bonnie, how are you? And welcome.
Thank you. As many of you might recall, I used to check in from Florida and now I'm in New York City. So it's not very nice out today, but I'm enjoying being here and I can't wait to hear Jenny's remarks. I might pop in and out because I have lots of emails coming, but look forward to hearing your remarks. Thank you.
Good. Kara Perry.
Hi, Perry.
Hi, Perry.
Hi, I'm sorry I don't have my my video on. I am in the car and unfortunately I'm gonna have to drop early, but I am in New Jersey. I am from Somerset County in Bridgewater, but driving in Bergen County. I'm not sure what town I'm driving through right now, but it's cold. Sun's coming in and out. On my way. Halfway to for Mother's Day, but the sun came out, and so that was really quite lovely. But I watched the last recording and really miss being in community with this group. So I'm going to pop in for as long as I can, and I love Jenny's last talk on this subject. So
Thanks.
Good to have you. Keep your eyes on the road. Somebody named J. Kim Wright. I don't know. Strange name.
Hi there. I have my eyes on the road, and like Kara, I'm going to be here as long as I can, but probably not the whole time.
We hope so.
And, yeah,
and I will.
In North Carolina.
Okay.
And I'm in North Carolina.
Great. And I'll end it by saying I am Perry Sedman. I am in Washington. I had the bad judgment to come up from Miami for a couple weeks where it was gorgeous. And now I'm looking out at rain and clouds and I have a sweatshirt on. That'll tell you everything you need to know about the weather. And I guess I turn it over now to Jennifer, who will make her presentation.
Okay, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. And I am in Toronto and I'm looking out at a beautiful spring day and at a giant pine tree in my backyard, which is now legally protected. My sons are building a laneway house behind here because they've redone the zoning law, so we're delighted to that. They'll be there for our old age. But you can't do anything until you bring in the tree doctors and they have to come and check several times to make sure the tree is going to be okay. And I'm very happy about that. So it's nice to see it actually impacting my private property. Okay, so some of you heard me talk before about my previous project, Part-Time for All, an argument about new norms, why everybody should participate in unpaid care. And in order to make that possible, nobody should do more than 30 hours a week of paid work. So as I was finishing that project,
I got asked to write an essay on a relational approach to property. And I'm so happy that Rand is here and actually had read my earlier work on Madison and property and the Constitution, because I see this current work as really enfolding all of my work, the property and the Constitution that I started with, laws relations, the care work, even the judgment work, I think is all going to come together in this project on more than human constitutionalism. But I had actually been a little worried. I thought after spending all this time on care, now I'm switching to property and more law-like things, and am I going to be abandoning care? But in fact, what that paper did was to make an argument about building in a responsibility to care to the earth into the legal definition of property and land, not some external environmental regulation that would limit your property, but that's what property means. To own land is to have a responsibility to current and future generations. And so then care became increasingly important. I came to see that care is actually central to the new kind of relationship that we need to cultivate with the earth. We here being Western settler peoples who have not been raised in traditions that treat the earth community as included in all our relations, a phrase from the Anishinaabe people. So all of the earth community becomes part of the subjects for whose respect and well-being we have to pay attention in everything we do, law and policy. And I've come to believe more and more that the depth of change that will be needed to mitigate climate change will require far more than an attention to prudent resource management. We've seen lots of data on that, and it's just not moving people to make the changes they need to do. I think it's going to require a fundamental shift in our relation to the earth. And rethinking property is key to that, but it's not the only part. So just about a year ago, I participated in a workshop called More Than Human Constitutionalism. It was about half Indigenous legal scholars and half settler scholars. And it was just a fabulous experience of bringing together these different traditions and thinking about the challenges of the environment. And so I drafted something for that, and then I got so interested in it that that's what I did all last summer, and I've continued to be working on it. And now, as I said, I see this as my next big project. And so what I saw as trying to write something for that context was that the idea of thinking about the more than human becomes a lens for rethinking constitutionalism. And I found that although I wanted to include the question of the extent to which Western traditions about how to organize government remain useful, what I really wanted to do was to use a different kind of meaning of the term constitutionalism. My core question was, how do we best constitute ourselves as cooperating communities that are safe and inclusive for all and foster wise decision-making? And I see this as a more open-ended and mutually respectful question than how do we govern ourselves with its traditions of power, control, and hierarchy. This version of the question of constitutionalism also makes it clear that it is no longer exclusively focused on states, especially not nation states, which I'll just come to this very briefly in this presentation. I spent a little more time on it in the paper. I think nation states are now both too small and too large for a lot of what we need to do. They have got to stop being our go-to presupposition of what the institutional arrangements are for our self-governance. So this new form of constitution would respond to and structure relations among the whole earth community, plants, animals, water, soil, air, rocks, mountains, as well as humans. All of them, and this is the key part, are potential participants. And different subcommunities would be bounded by different geographical territories or groups of participants of different sizes for different purposes. So scale becomes an important issue here, which I'll return to. So all constitutional values, I don't really have to tell you this, all constitutional systems rest on a system of values, sometimes explicit, sometimes not. So for example, most Western constitutions presume a basic framework of rights rather than responsibilities. That is the frame for thinking through almost everything. and most presume a fairly individualistic understanding of those rights and of core values like liberty and security. So today I'm going to begin with a discussion of the values that I think should ground more than human constitutionalism, and that will require a fundamental transformation of the dominant norms, beliefs, and values of most of the Anglo world. And then I'll turn to just a brief mention of some of the questions of implementing more than human constitutionalism, and then make just a brief note about some of the changes in existing law and policy that would be necessary to foster this. And then I'll close with what I see as one of the greatest challenges to this transformation, other than, I should say, what I won't be talking about is the practical issue of resistance of those whose privileges will be disrupted by this sort of change. And close with offering a source of hope that I see. So values. The first is responsibility. So I think rights will continue to have a role in our conceptualization of how to think about how we relate to one another, all of us, all of our relations. But I think that a responsibility framework as the starting point is going to be more useful. So one phrase is kin-centric, as in all of our kin, all of our relations. Another is earth-based. Constitutionalism would need to be supported by widely embraced norms of both individual and collective responsibility. And I have in mind a principle of mutual responsibility for the thriving of the interdependent members of the Earth community. The idea of mutual responsibility is different from mutual respect for individual rights, which, as you all know, are entitlements, claims upon others, which in the Anglo-liberal tradition have mostly been for refraining from harm or interference. In the Anglo tradition of constitutionalism, the primary focus of constitutional rights has been on limits to what the state can legitimately do. Mutual responsibility is also subtly, but importantly different from a belief in human responsibility to others, objects, lesser others, such as animals or an ecological system. They are often imagined as objects of concern for whom we might have this benevolent, implicitly hierarchical relationship, but rarely as subjects, as agents who are participants in collective cooperation and interdependence, and thus with their own reciprocal responsibilities and their own role in shaping the structures and patterns by which we live together. Now, I draw a lot of this from indigenous legal traditions, particularly the Anishinaabeg, which is the one I know best. The idea that the interdependence of the entire Earth community generates truly mutual responsibility has only fairly recently gained some recognition within cultures that have long denied it. For those of us not raised with the skills to listen to the earth, to understand the earth as a source of law, we face many layers of challenges in figuring out how to reconfigure constitutionalism so that the violence and exclusion that have long been built into it can be replaced by full participation, cooperation, and mutual responsibility. Learning to listen to those who do have that knowledge and skills and norms, both humans and more than humans, is the first huge task. And it may seem that it would be easier to learn to listen to the human voices that have been excluded and ignored than to take seriously that animals and plants have something to contribute. But I think some similar massive shift towards humility is required to listen to excluded human voices as well, especially those who do have this aptitude, skill, and capacity for listening to the non-human. So that's a brief set of thoughts about how responsibility becomes the dominant framework rather than rights, and that this mutual responsibility is different from a kind of hierarchical responsibility of subjects to objects. The next set of values, which I'll just say very little about, is freedom, safety, and inclusive participation. So I just want to note that true inclusive participation for humans requires equality and safety from violence. something very few societies have actually achieved for women and for many segments of their populations. Freedom and safety are also inherently complex values for creatures living in interdependent relations with both their own species and the wider Earth community. Safety, for example, will never mean a guarantee against harm or even violent death. Think about lions and vulnerable gazelles. Given the inherently predatory interdependence of life forms, from bacteria to lions, who live off one another, I must admit that many of the practical details of creating a new framework for how to live in mutual respect and responsibility remain something of a mystery to me. I take comfort from the fact that indigenous cultures who take this interdependence seriously have thought about this question for thousands of years and built legal systems around them. And in addition, some problems are simpler than others. There are forms of violence, such as factory farms and clear-cutting of forests, that seem obviously unnecessary for human life and inimical to mutual respect and responsibility. And we do not need to have all the answers or even all the questions in advance to try to advance the core values of more than human constitutionalism by ending the worst forms of violence we inflict on all our relations, including one another. So the next value is care. So just as responsibility needs to take on new meanings and a new centrality in constitutionalism, care needs to be fundamentally revalued for more than human constitutionalism to thrive. And as I mentioned, my previous book talked about how to accomplish that by restructuring both work and care. What I want to add here is that the mutual responsibility I discussed needs to be infused with care. People need to learn that care for one another and for the earth are essential forms of reciprocity and of great value to both individuals and communities. In the paper, I turn here to a section on implementation, but I highlight the point that even optimal institutional design or lists of rights or core values in a constitution cannot themselves achieve the deep transformation of values that will be necessary for more than human constitutionalism. That will require an engagement by all sectors of society. But I am going to just briefly note a couple of the implementation issues. So one of the ones that I was particularly eager to talk about here is thinking about what are good ways for us to talk to one another when we're trying to make collective decisions about how to cooperate together. So here there's particularly the issue of persuasion. So historically, you know, we contrast persuasion with violence. So if those are your options, persuasion is obviously better. But I think persuasion often crosses over into a kind of control. And this is especially important for activists. Getting others to agree, to join in collective efforts of transformation, has long been an accepted part of social activism. In my view, that means that activism and political engagement more generally has often had a large component of control built into it, or aspirations to control. And I don't think control is a respectful way for humans to treat one another, and most people hate feeling controlled. I think that for humans, and perhaps others who use language, open, attentive listening and efforts at open and honest expression is a better model than persuasion. More than human constitutionalism will have to explore what norms, practices, and institutions can foster open listening and honest expression. So I'll just note one other particular question about how to think about organizing ourselves is to ask the question, how much time should most humans or most human communities devote to acquiring these skills for unfamiliar listening, learning, and communicating with anyone who speaks in a fundamentally different way from us? Of course, at the far end, that's animals, plants, and the earth. But there are lots of different modes of this, non-verbal humans. This task of learning to listen to a wider scope of other beings, I think, is a really important challenge for more than human constitutionalism. And this takes us to the questions of scope and scale. Some of the important knowledge needed for transformative policy is best gained at a local scale. For example, it'll often be important to have a detailed knowledge of a particular land with its plants, animals, microbes, water sources, etc. But of course, at the same time, global forces of many kinds are impacting that land. And if one builds factories or mines on the land, that impact will be global. So we need knowledge of these interconnections, of these different scales of impact and decision-making, so that we have consultation and communication across the different layers and levels of decision-making. And so reflections on constitutions need to take these issues of scale and scope into account. Now, there's a related question of the scope and scale of impact and how that is connected to what we code as important. So I think the more intimate a relationship is, the more likely it is to be reciprocal. So for example, contrast personal care, which can be genuinely reciprocal, versus charitable donations, which are important, but not reciprocal. I think intimate relationships are also likely to have a smaller scale impact than the relationships one forms in paid work, especially work that's coded as important. Indeed, the larger the scope of impact, say university dean or president or judge or head of a large corporation or NGO, the less intimate the relationships with the subjects of their work. These important roles involve less direct care. In short, scope and scale of impact seems to be in an inverse relationship with intimate relations and direct care. At present, Western societies code success as being as high up the hierarchy of power and impact as possible. And this almost always means doing little care. And I think something similar is true about relations with the natural world. For example, we can learn directly, experientially, about receiving care from the earth and providing care in return by as simple acts as gardening. We can learn about the deep bond possible with more than human creatures like dogs when we live with them and give and receive care with them. But the impact of those kinds of relationships is going to be less than if one is successfully organizing sanctuaries for animals or creating conservation trusts or lobbying for laws that will make such projects easier. Even trying to come to know animals, both domestic like cows and wild like gorillas or giraffes, well enough to know what they are like and how our actions can harm them, takes a kind of time similar to that of an intimate relationship. I think most humans thrive and learn best when they know, and learn what they need to know to support good communities, if they're regularly involved in both direct care and in activities at larger scales, where they can feel their contribution to a wider range of Earth's constituents, human and more than human. Trying to organize these different kinds of contribution through the age-old and, of course, highly gendered division of labor cannot be an adequate approach. New institutional structures must not reinscribe this old hierarchy of what counts as important. Now, there are a whole set of questions about representation, which is a big issue in any, traditional notions of constitutionalism. And I talk a little bit about some of those more traditional approaches, but here I just want to note the huge challenges of representation when you're talking about more than human. And whether you use a rights-focused, you give rights to rivers, you're going to have some kind of guardian or trustee-like relationship who's going to make sure those rights are recognized. Or you go directly to an idea of responsibility in a trust-like relationship. You're going to have to call on humans who have the capacity to know what those non-human entities need, want, understand. And so here I just want to mention one thing which has gotten some more attention lately in the world of democratic theory, which is these citizen legislative assemblies. Sometimes they're randomly selected, sometimes they're selected around particular areas of expertise. They make their decisions, and usually they're not directly binding, but they make recommendations, sometimes binding to larger forms of decision makers. This kind of thing is particularly well suited to making extra space for the people who have these skills of paying attention to the non-human. It's very hard to figure out how you would just do that with Congress or Parliament. So this is another reason to be thinking creatively about these other forms of democratic decision-making. Okay, I have a note about my doubts about judicial review, but I think I'm just going to leave that for the moment. I do think it's a good idea for constitutions to designate certain values as requiring special forms of protection and special forms of decision-making. The problem is that almost every constitution from the 20th century has modeled the way of doing that on the American model of judicial review, which puts this interpretation of rights in the least democratic, most elite and exclusive part of the government. And this cannot be a good idea. We need other ways of thinking about how you create different sorts of checks and balances to protect these special values other than judicial review. So I think I'll just note property needs to be reimagined, both in this idea, as I said, of building in a responsibility to care for present and future generations into the meaning of land ownership, and also to redefine, to create whole new legal mechanisms for productive enterprises, so that we don't assume that the ones who own what's produced are the ones who invest capital rather than labor, but not just that we don't limit our imagination to capital and labor as the relevant stakeholders in who ought to be participating in the decisions that involve productive enterprise. Criminal law, similarly, is all very focused on assigning individual responsibility, which is a huge problem in any society that has systemic inequalities built into it. You have to have some kind of collective framework for understanding both who's subject to harm and who's likely to perpetrate harm. Okay, so here's my conclusion. I think all these core values, institutional design and specific policy changes, require something more than any one of them. We need an overarching change in stance towards life that connects the issues of scale, care, and relationship with the tasks of collective cooperation. A key part of the necessary change is the revaluation of the role of care in our lives as interdependent creatures, not just with other humans, but with the rest of the Earth community we rely on for our lives. And I think we come to experience the reality of that interdependence by providing care for humans and for the Earth, in both instances with hands-on embodied care. This can provide a visceral knowledge that is not available from policy advocacy or donations to environmental groups. Active care then becomes a vital part of how we can collectively shift from the still dominant individualism to a full embrace of interdependence. Of course, feminist theorists, among others, have been advocating for such a shift for a long time. But I think there have recently been changes throughout at least the Western world that makes this shift more possible. So I want to close with a hope and a challenge. So the hope is that I think interdependence is a fact of life. I think that's the most foundational of the lessons we learn from both human and more than human life forms. When I wrote Laws Relations, 15 years ago or something, I thought I needed to spend a lot of time explaining why humans were fundamentally dependent on one another, not just for care as infants or in old age, but for the development of our core capacities, such as autonomy and creativity. But now, with the proliferation of evidence of the complex connection and communication among life forms like trees, I think interdependence is an increasingly recognized scientific fact. And so here's the hope. I think it's reasonable to hope that the science of interdependence will finally overcome the philosophy of individualism, a philosophy that neoliberalism relies on and props up, as it teaches us that we do not have to attend to collective responsibility because everyone is or should be responsible for themselves. The values, laws, norms, and institutions of more than human constitutionalism should be guided by an ethics of interdependence, which will be sustained by this increasing recognition of scientific fact. Now, the challenge is this. A recognition of interdependence is not the same as a recognition of animals, plants, and rocks as fellow subjects in a community of more than human constitutionalism. Many people still see humans as obviously on the top of a value hierarchy, even though they are also obviously dependent on plants, animals, soil, water, and air. We need to understand what can ground or move people toward a view of the whole earth and all its creatures as fellow subjects, not just objects we need to take better care of, with their own claims to respect, integrity, and care. What kind of language can we use when for some the foundation of this care and respect is spiritual? But for others, this is an unacceptable foundation for public values. This is a subject that this group thinks about in a lot of different contexts. And so here, I'm happy to say that thanks to meetings I had with people at Johns Hopkins, I've discovered that there is a huge proliferation of different ways of articulating the agency and claims to respect and care of the non-human that is not grounded in what I think of as spiritual language. I first thought, well, you just can't get there from here without something like that, but it's not true. I really met people who have absolutely the same kind of commitment and passion that I do, but it doesn't come from that source. And so this is going to be a place where we need multiple forms of language to ground this sense of respect and care. So in conclusion, I think nothing short of a profound change in our collective relationship to the whole Earth community as one of mutual care and respect can provide the basis for and the motivation for the depth of changes necessary to respond to climate change and to create more truly human communities. I think the lens of more than human constitutionalism can help us think through the many forms of change that will be necessary. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. The floor is open, everyone, for thoughts, reactions, questions. Yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
I see there are things in the chat which I haven't tried to look at, but anyway.
Okay.
So I'll jump in because I have to go. I just want to say, Jenny, thank you so much. And I read Laws of Relations a number of years ago, loved it. It's an amazing work of scholarship, and I can feel how you're continuing to move. What you're saying is part of the reason I decided not to be a lawyer after going to law school and became a psychotherapist, was it's the intimacy of one-to-one care.
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't agree more. I wanted to ask your response to what Christina Woods is doing with regard to Nature's Trust. Do you know anything about that here in the States?
Yeah, just a little. So there's much more of these conservancy trusts in the US than in Canada. And one of the reasons I gather is that although you might think Canada would be the perfect place, 90% of Canadian land is publicly owned. Owned by the Crown. But what this means in practice is that the provinces control it. And the provinces are always, are the version of states. They're interested in economic development. And in Canada, all the minerals and everything always resides with the Crown. It doesn't pass with the ownership of the property. And so even if you create a very tight conservancy trust, if the province wants to come in and authorize a mining company, it can do it. You can't block that. With a conservancy trust. And so I think here we're trying to figure out what the range of options are around conservancy trusts. But so that seems to me one of the right paths forward. It's because it's still using language of trust and responsibility rather than rights.
Right. So another one of the things that she's doing, though, is organizing young people to file a lawsuit so that their future rights to clean water and clean air, like the common law trusts that were held, so that she's creating this responsibility in current generations for future generations, and so the land trust is a little separate. She's doing that, but this other question seems to be more closely aligned to what you're recommending. And I just wondered if you were familiar with that and had any comments.
I'm not, and I'd be happy if you send me some information about it, because I'm not hostile to the rights language, but it's not my preferred language. But it sounds like this is a melding of I have a right to somebody treating this in a trust-like way.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
that's I'm keen to see more about that.
Thanks so much. I have to go.
Okay, nice to see you.
Take
Thanks for
care.
coming.
Bye, Denver.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Jenny, I can jump in with a question. I mean, I had a number of questions sort of coming up for me as you were speaking, and I loved your talk, and I love it, and I feel like the the holistic approach to communication, to community building, all the things that have been in development or either being renewed from indigenous wisdom or just being developed in terms of modalities in recent times are all, laying a groundwork for what you're speaking of. So I guess I had a few questions. I guess one is, can the kinds of community that you're talking about coexist with the nation state model? And can people, can we, and maybe this builds a little on Duncan's question, is there any way that the existing legal system can be used to push for the recognition of the more than human constitutionalism?
Yeah.
Those are a couple of thoughts.
Okay, so yes to both. We can't just go about dismantling nation states, but what we can do is build on top of them, right? So that, at the moment, very few nation states are actually either able or willing to do anything about, say, the kind of financialized power that we see in equity trusts and the housing crisis all over the world. So this needs, some kind of international response. But even after all these years of the UN and GATT and various things, none of these are models of democratic decision making. So we really need to rethink how we're going to do it when we need larger still scale, as well as I said, smaller scale. So I see the nation states as temporarily carrying on between these, but I do expect that some of their sovereignty claims will come under challenge. So, like keeping out anybody who doesn't want to come in, right? That has been assumed to be part of the definition of sovereignty, and that's either going to just actually collapse in the face of climate refugees, or better, it will be responded to in advance. And then there are also the challenges which all the settler states, both Canada, it's much more a live issue in Canada than in the US, but our sovereignty in both countries rests on repudiated doctrines of terra nullius and doctrine of discovery. That's how we claimed our sovereignty. Nobody believes, even the Catholic Church has repudiated these. So on what does it rest? So I think it's a good thing to be not taking the sovereign claims, which are very tied to territory and exclusion and property, as given, but we can do these other layers on top of that. And then, sorry, what was the second question? I definitely had an answer to that.
Oh, the second question is, can we use the existing legal system?
Yes. Yeah. So I think we have to. I think we can't, private law even, which is unfortunately the preserve of lawyers only, right? If you don't go to law school, you don't know anything about private law. You don't know the extent it structures the power arrangements of society. So that's one thing. I think it should be taught in high schools and universities to everybody. You shouldn't have to have a law degree to understand the core of private law. But it's too important not to make it a subject of change. That's really my view. And, you can quibble about the terms, but my own view is just let's stick with the term property and make it mean something different legally. Create new legal instruments, which the rich and powerful have been busy doing very creatively for the last 20 years in the financialization world. They've got the best minds working on this, and they're doing a fantastic job of creating more and more new instruments. So we have to figure out the new instruments we need for new structures of of productivity and new structures of property owning. So definitely, and we've got these tools, you know, we've got trusts. There's a huge, and interestingly, the indigenous legal traditions have their own versions, with slightly different versions of fiduciary responsibility. So we can learn from those as well. Those are hugely capacious concepts. And then we've got the duty of care, which means something extremely limited in tort law, you know, but it's available to us, right, as a cognizable tool to expand and change its reach.
Thank you, Jenny. I was thinking in our very early PISLAP conversations, Peter Gable used to speak a lot about the duty of care and, really in a sense how limited it is. It's interpreted, and that there's just a much deeper foundation that's possible. And and it just feels like it's kind of, I guess what we've been advocating in PISLAP is kind of an inside-outside approach, that you use the legal system to advance not only human rights, but also other ways of safeguarding what your interdependence. Hadn't really used that language before, but we're also creating sort of parallel systems, restorative practices and other kinds of unit of justice, like Sylvia's working on, and other approaches and ways of being in the legal culture. And I'm sure some of the indigenous law work that advance the interdependence model, but are sort of parallel to the existing legal system. So you sort of work inside and outside in a way.
And, when you think back to the evolution of duty of care, the question, well, who is my neighbor, right? So people assume that question applied only to humans, but why would it, right? It's a perfectly capacious idea. Who is my neighbor? Who are my relations? We just need to think of that much more expansively. But it's available. We've got a language that's available.
Yes, we do. Perry.
Jennifer, thank you very much for that inspiring talk. Lot of interesting issues opened up to me. And in order to bring your vision into reality, what is the next big thing that has to happen?
So I think there are multiple things, and it's one of those things, like most large scale changes, different people will have different skills and interests. And so I think, like the multiplicity of things that this group is involved with, whether it's prisons or education, or these are all things that can support this kind of change. But for me, and partly, building on my background and interests, I'm going to come back to property, where I started. My first book was on property, and how the preoccupation with protecting property distorted the structure of the American Constitution. But now, I want to think about this constructively. And I don't know how many of you guys know this fantastic UK book called Trespass? I recommend Nick Hayes. I really recommend it. It's just beautiful. He's a woodcutter. He has great, the book is organized around a deliberate trespassing through England. And so 98% of the land in England is governed by trespass laws. And so he goes from the commons, the enclosure movement, on up to the, the exclusion, the ever widening exclusion of access to land. But the reason I raised it is that he uses this wonderful language of a spell. Private property casts a spell. You're walking along just a wooded path doing nothing, and somebody shows up and says, "You're on my property." And you go, "Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'll, I made a mistake," and so he had that experience himself. And so this sense of how, when you invoke that term, especially, in the Anglo world anyway, it carries all this weight of inviolability and essentialness. And so I think for me, that's one of the first targets. Because it's stronger in the US than in Canada, but it's here too. I think it's throughout the common law world. This sense that property is so entangled with privacy and security and autonomy, which insulates it from its connections to power and hierarchy and domination, thinking back to Rianne's talk last week. So I think part of our objective, and this, you know, this is not just for lawyers by any means, right, is to break that spell, you know, and to create a new set of myths, powerful myths. So that's the kind of thing artists and songwriters and storytellers are gifted at, in generating a new mythology around our relationship to land and to productive creation. You know, I always, it is the means of production, the Marxian phrase, but that has a very particularly limited valence to it. But our human capacity to produce stuff, which, you know, we need to live, but we need to organize it in some much different way. But to do that, we have to offer some, not both legal, technical alternatives. You know, you could create a new enterprise organized like this, so the community had a stake, the people who bought the stuff had a stake, that, you know, you could have a different legal organization of ownership. So that, we need that. But then we also need this kind of collective, affective, mythic shift in our relationship to the material.
Okay. So Jenny, I am really, really grateful to you for this presentation today. And I was writing notes, a lot of them, as you were speaking, because I hear so many places where unitive justice intersects with what you were talking about. And so I would like to engage at some other time when we can just go into that.
Me
talk
too.
about
Let's
that.
set up a Zoom.
Because I see so much here. You talked about activism often has control as a part of it. And I believe that's because it's coming out of a dualistic understanding of the world. And that's, you know, so you're going to control those that aren't doing what you want. That's what we know, but we have to transcend that. So in order to achieve what you're talking about, we do have to come from unitive consciousness. And how do we get there? But I think that when we get into unitive consciousness, we discover ways to use the present systems to achieve our goals. We discover the entry points into those systems that are adaptable to this new thinking and this way of being. And in those systems, I believe, like the criminal law system, I believe we can go into jails and prisons and teach personal transformation, because that takes time, and that's where people have time.
Yeah.
But to do that, we don't fight the present system at all. We're not going to join the anti-prison movement, because that's just opposition and confrontation and scares a lot of people. So if we go into jails and prisons and teach this personal transformation and the tools for that, and then when they come out, they go to the communities and they teach that, and they dismantle the punitive system by impacting the number of people that go into it. But that's totally coming from a unitive perspective. But I think that everything we do, we must avoid opposition and confrontation, because that puts us back into the duality consciousness. But anyway, so I want to get on your schedule.
Yes, I'd really be, I'd love to do that. Let me just say that, so I think this idea of entry through existing systems, and that it's vital, right? Because we can't wait till we recreate entire news. But I just push back slightly. It's like this, when Perry asked, where do you start? Well, we start at multiple points, you know, and different people will go after different things. And I do think that the abolition movement is incredibly important, even though it's not going to happen in anywhere in the near future. But just, I see that my students, my law students, really understand that the carceral solution to harm being done is kind of more harm, you know, and even increasingly, like I had a student who wanted to write a paper on the issue of, should we add femicide to the Canadian Criminal Code, as has been done in some of the Latin American countries with very little effect. And so she did write a paper, and she wrote a really good paper following up on my suggestions of, but is the object of the game to put more people in jail? Because feminists have always been caught around this idea of, the law sends a message about what counts. And so if we don't lock up rapists for 50 years, people won't think rape matters. But, why would you want to do that? So I think it's really helpful to have this, since we have these massive prisons at huge public expense, to use this, as you say, this captive population to think differently, so they come out instead of just ferociously angry, with a different framework. Yeah.
So I agree about there's a benefit of that abolitionist approach. So back in the 70s, I was a new attorney, and it was the height of the women's movement. And there were the bra burners. And the bra burners were talking about tear it all down, and they scared the hell out of the legislators. And so they were really worried about the bra burners. And so I, in my business suit and my pearls, would go in and talk about, now we could just do this part of the reform. And they would say, yes, let's do that part. We're not going to, we're not dealing with the bra burners. We're going to do it this way. So yes, I think that those abolitionist movements can soften the grain.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The people who do these preferences, how people set their preferences, Americans at least always want to go for the middle. And so what counts as the middle? Well, that's one of the things I learned when I moved to Canada. All of a sudden the middle had moved left by a lot. What was possible to say in the mainstream in Canada was this is a social democratic country to a significant degree. It's not Sweden, but anyway, if you don't have somebody out there staking out what is supposed to be the fringe, then nobody's going to take seriously the more modest changes that. Yeah, but I do say it's deeper than that. I want people to think about in very much the same ways you're talking. There's something fundamentally oppositional about punishment, right? If somebody does something wrong, what should we do? Well, let's lock them up. It's it's crazy, and students can see that as a viable, real way of thinking differently, in a way that I think 20 years ago, very few people were.
Jenny, I think Lisa had a question.
Oh, good. Lisa, so nice to see you.
Yeah, I just love what you're saying, and I come from a paramilitaristic organization, the labor movement, and we're constantly trying to persuade people. But I wanted to hear more about the active listening and questioning model. If you have examples and what became of it, and I'm interested in that.
Thank you. So my other project, which keeps being put on the back burner, but I'm intent on finishing it this summer, is a book on judgment. It's building on Hannah Arendt's work on judgment. She was my thesis supervisor, and I really wanted to return, and I met her by going to a seminar on judgment. And so the idea of persuasion is very big for her, that what we do when we judge is we take the perspectives of others into account. And then we rethink our own judgment in relation to the perspectives of others. And if we don't do that, all you have is your private opinion. You don't have a publicly valid judgment. So, but she uses the language of, I'm going to tell you my perspective. I'm going to persuade you of my perspective. And the very first time I did a public talk on this was at Queen's Law School, decades ago. And there were several Indigenous students in the group. And they said to me, well, we have talking circles where the object, everybody, you go around the circle, and your responsibility is to tell how you see the issue as honestly and as fully as possible. And the responsibility of everybody else is to listen as hard as possible. But nobody is trying to persuade anybody. And they would have experienced anybody who was trying to persuade as a disrespect of their autonomy. You offer your perspective as fully as possible, and I listen. And of course, this is a therapeutic, right? Most people who've ever done couples counseling, there's some version of that you learn to do. You learn to just listen without trying to figure out what your response is going to be, or try to command that you're the right. You learn to listen. And this is just not how our elected officials behave, right? This is not what happens in Parliament or Congress, and or even for that matter in courtrooms, right? The whole project is persuasion. But more troubling is, I think, is the activism. And I was surprised recently. There's a wonderful book that I hope I can actually get him to come talk. James Rowe. It's called Radical Mindfulness, and it's on, the subtitle is Why Overcoming the Fear of Death is Politically Vital. The way in which our fear of death motivates so many distortions, and I believe this. So, but he comes out of Buddhist tradition. I ask him this thing about the persuasion, because he's also an activist in various ways. Oh, no, you got to persuade, you got to get them to go along. And so I was kind of shocked, actually. But so it's deep, deep, deep in the culture, and the culture of activism, and the culture of, improvement. But I think it's misguided. And I think we all know in the interpersonal context, the difference between trying to, when you tell your perspective, there's an element of exposure, right? I'm just telling you how I see it. I'm not trying to get you to see me. I have to expose, you have to listen. And it's building a different kind of relationship than the trying to get, which I think it's almost universal. That's what you're supposed to do. If you think there's an injustice in the world, you got to go out there and fix it and get people to see it differently. And so, but I think this is one of the many areas where I think Indigenous groups, who often get conflated with a kind of collectivism which doesn't value the individual, but that's really not true at all. At least in the Anishinaabe tradition, tremendous weight put on individual freedom and autonomy. But it's a freedom and autonomy enabled by participation in a freedom-loving collective. So, yeah.
I would just say we visit people to talk about the union and tell, if we're allowed to talk, which takes about 10 visits, we tell our story. So I think we might start with your model, but we definitely end with the crunch, as some people call it, the push. And I'm just, so you're talking about something that sort of melts into the culture from these discussions, these more open discussions, that has a kind of a melting way of changing things, maybe.
Well, it's my understanding. I mean, I really have very limited knowledge, but that these talking circles are sometimes, not always, but sometimes they are there to make a decision. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, I don't know whether there's a vote but the point is they're good, and it's not thousands of people, right? It could be maybe as many as 100, but usually smaller than that. So they're not just sharing for the point of sharing. They've got a decision to take, but the way to do that,
I see.
Yeah, so it's not it's not just free floating. There's
got it.
We need to decide what to do, and this is how we're going to do it.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much, Jennifer. This has been very, very interesting and inspiring. And I just have two brief comments. One is, as I'm sure you and many other people know, the issue of persuasion came up very sharply at the dawn of Western democracy. This was a huge debate in ancient Athens and other entities, and for exactly the reasons you say, what was legitimate, what was manipulative, And so there's a whole huge tradition there that throws
Yes.
light on this. But the other comment I wanted to make, I loved your comment about artists making up new kinds of myths. And I just happened to have the May 6th, 2024
I have
cover of the New Yorker magazine.
Uh-huh.
This is a very famous African American artist named Faith Ringgold, and the title of this piece is Sonny's Bridge, 1986. And you can see it's like the Brooklyn Bridge. There are skyscrapers here going in New York, and she's famous use of quilting is all over this quilt, and the central figure is a Black jazz musician playing the saxophone on this bridge. So she's taken this iconic image of our modern society, and she's doing all kinds of fascinating things with it. So it just struck me as an interesting example of what you're talking about.
Thank you. I have it, and I didn't even see it. So I'll I'll look at that more closely. Yeah.
Did anyone else have a comment or question before we wrap up?
I want to hear something from you about how does this fit with your work?
Me?
No, Janelle, from Sustainable Economies. You. Did I say it right, Janelle?
Yeah. I just wrote in the chat that I'm speechless. I actually am. Gosh, what to say? Well, I co-founded Sustainable Economies Law Center 14 and a half years ago. I just stepped back from it in part because I was finding that the legal solutions we were working on just didn't feel like the real solutions to me. And I feel like it's solutions of care, connection, and spirit that are really going to transform society. And so I started to read your paper today, and I found it breathtaking. And same with this talk. And I've just been taking a lot of notes, and I'm gonna let it all sink in. But I do find one of the things that kind of drove me to leave my work was I was just finding that the real things that were happening, and I was specifically focusing on protecting land conservation, land back to Indigenous people, creating housing justice through collective housing models. I was finding it's not the legal solutions that are protecting the land and protecting the people involved. It's the people and their intimate relationships. It's the face-to-face, eye-to-eye, getting to know each other, routinely caring for each other, that commits people almost on a cellular level. It's almost like mapping the bylaws of our cells to care for each other and land. And I was like, I need to quit my job and learn how to talk about that. And I'm still learning. I like what you said about it feeling like, for a while at least, that there weren't ways of talking about this without sounding spiritual, because I'm about to give 2 talks. I'm going to Hamburg, Germany tomorrow, and then to Amsterdam after that. And I'm like, I really want to talk about how it's all about love, but people don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that from the lawyer that they just invited to come present. And I think you're right that, there's maybe scientific ways. I really love Jeremy Lent's book, The Web of Meaning, as a way to sort of talk about the scientific reality of our deep interconnectedness. And so, I'll pull from those. But yeah, I think this is my rambly response because you asked me for my input while I was in a moment of speechlessness. But yeah, this is wonderful, and I'd love to stay in touch.
I really appreciate that. And I do think it's, these things ultimately have to be combined, right? We have to think about the questions of property and ask ourselves. So that was in laws relations. What kind of relationships is this particular legal regime going to foster?
Mm-hmm.
And are those relationships the ones that will, advance whatever the issue at stake is, more liberty, more security, more privacy, or not? But so the question of relationships can be asked in the context of what legal apparatus, do we aim for, or we can, or the other way, as a diagnostic tool. What's wrong? How has this problem been generated by our existing laws, which are, but the real trick is, just as you said, that the people doing the work we're all trained. This is the part that actually I'm particularly preoccupied with right now. We're all trained to think that what matters in life is this large scale impact, and that is inconsistent with, you know, the way we've organized how to do that large scale impact. You don't have any time for friends or family or even your dog. You hire a dog walker. You know, it's so we've created a system. You know, if there were a devil organizing it, they couldn't have done a better job, you know, of putting all the rewards for people to move further and further away from human connection. And all the power, the more powerful you are, the less time you have for care. You hire other people to do the care. That's how you know you're important. So it's, and I feel it. You know, I write about this for years now, and I on a daily basis, I feel this. Can I believe that taking my dog for a walk or spending time talking to my husband is as important as, you know, getting my grades in on time, which affects lots of people, or, you know, putting in the proposal for this conference, or anyway, it's a deep, deep thing of what counts as important. And we need to be able to do both. We need a system where everybody gets to have these intimate, sustaining relationships, which feed then the way we do our work at the high level impact. But we don't do it that way. We split it up. Some people do the big impact and some people do the actual human contact. Yeah.
So beautifully said. Thank you.
And Libby put a comment in the chat. Just wanted to bring that to your attention, Jenny.
Okay. I'm trying to, great. Yes, I really, and you know, I hope maybe Nanette will send out my email, because I think so many of you are, you know, involved with things that would be useful as, you know, as examples for me.
Yeah, let's just put it in the chat right now.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah. Oh, right. This is the kids lit it. Yeah, for right. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Jane Nedelsky. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's good.
Which one do you have? Do you have the Toronto one?
YorkU, osgood.yorku.ca. Is that right?
Yeah, it is for now. I'm about to leave them. So I
yes,
just
you will.
My last set of papers. So I end my time at Osgood at the end of December, and I'm happy to say that I'm going off to Sweden. So it's at the Gothenburg University. So I'll spend about a month there.
How long?
A month. Well, it's all for the whole year, but in person for a month in the fall and a month in the spring. And then I'll do the rest virtually. So I'm very keen to get hooked up with, you know, the Nordic environmental folk, and also the, you know, so I'll just say one last thing, which is because, so Lisa, I don't know if you're still there, but, you know, I've dabbled a little bit in the labor law and looking for, you know, alternatives, but at least the American progressive labor law, this is a really crude way of putting it, still seems to be about how can we beg the corporations to treat their workers a little bit better, or give them some tiny little more voice, as opposed to, well, let's restructure the thing. Why are the people doing the work having to beg the people put in the capital? Who said it? You know, that's a property regime. That's fixable, not easily, but yeah.
And just one thing to throw out, which is that we are hoping to do a PISLAP call in the future on this whole issue of language, using the word love, which has always been used in PISLAP. Jenny has a different approach, and some of the issues we talked about, it's a tricky question, and I think it really bears some dialogue and explanation. So hopefully that'll be a future call.
Good. Yeah, and we hope maybe to get something more on Indigenous law too, right?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, I want to thank Jenny for an outstanding and so thought-provoking talk. And I think there's so many threads to pick up, and it just gives us a framework and a vision. And it also really, I think, fit very well with Rian Eisler's talk that came before yours. It really built on that foundation.
I'm actually planning to go back to look at her books too. I mean, I knew it's been a long time since I've read, and so now I haven't read the latest one. So looking forward to that.
It was
Okay,
a
and
very
I hope-
persuasive presentation.
Thank you. Do we know when we might meet in Minneapolis? Do you know when you're aiming for that?
Well, it's Harry, do you want to?
Yeah,
Well,
I'm not gonna be able to do it in the fall because I'm going to be, traveling, but
I think we're looking at dates for mid to late November. And Kim Wright has agreed to host this time in North Carolina in her little town, and we're looking as we speak into facilities there. So we're working at that with Kim, me and Nanette, and hope to have an announcement soon.
great. Okay, and that's not hurricane season there?
Not in November. No, not in November.
I should be back by November, late November.
Good.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So
Right, thank you all.
thoughts and suggestions.
Okay.
Right, and I'll send out the recording to
Great,
folks.
thank you.
All right, many thanks for joining. Welcome to Janelle as a new one.
Yeah.
Please come join us again.
Thank you. I'm so glad I came. Thank you for hosting and thank you for that talk, Jenny.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Great to see you.